Bicycle and Pedestrian Counting Pilot Project Technical Webinar number 3. I'm Jeremy Raw with the Federal Highway Administration Office of Planning, and I'll be joined by Bob Schneider and the rest of our technical team to do a presentation on data management, and then later on we will host a discussion on challenges, successes, and other issues that any of you may wish to talk about with the technical team and those of us here at Federal Highway. This session initially will be in listen-only mode, so you won't be able to talk right away. If you do have something you'd like to communicate to the panelists, get a question off your mind while Bob's still talking or one of the other technical support folks, please put it in the chat pod. You'll see that down at the bottom of the list of different elements that we have in the webinar, and we'll address those questions in addition to ones that we get verbally at the end of the session. So without further ado, I think I will hand this over to Professor Robert Schneider of the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, a national expert on bicycle and pedestrian counting, who will talk to us about factoring in data analysis and the kinds of things you can do with data once you start getting it. So Bob, it's your turn.
All right. Thanks so much, Jeremy, and thanks everyone for joining in on the webinar today. What we're going to be talking about here are really a mix of some practical guidance and technical analysis, really stuff that you can get into once you've got your counters out in the field and are starting to gather data from those devices. And so I'm going to just cover some practical stuff in terms of downloading data, cleaning it, then applying some corrections potentially, and then give some examples of how the data can be analyzed. And one of them, what I'll spend probably the most time on from the technical side, is talking about how to expand short-term counts to annual volume estimates. That's one of the things that's commonly done with pedestrian and bicycle count data, as well as regular other motor vehicle count data as well. So then after I go through all those, we'll have some time to discuss questions that you may have about what I've presented, and then hear a little bit about how you guys are doing in each of your regions in terms of progress and challenges, so we can have some interactive discussion about that. So first, once you've got your counters set up, thinking about how best to download the data is a next important step. And depending on the device you have, there are different ways to download the data. And it's important to be working with the vendor who provided you the counter to know how to get the data the best. In some cases, you need to go into the field and plug a laptop in or plug your phone or PDA into that device to grab the data from it. In other cases, you can do Bluetooth from the field, so you don't actually need to bring a wire with you. And then there's some other vendors who offer remote downloads. And so you can go to a vendor website, and they essentially host the data for you, and you can download it from there. I'll show you an example of that in a second. Another thing to think about with downloading the data is what sort of schedule do you want to have for downloading the counts. You can have a shorter schedule and collect data on a regular basis. I'll just say monthly is a shorter time period that you may consider. Doing this, of course, means you need to either go out to the site or be checking the data online every month, so you're downloading it regularly. But it does allow you to get data sooner, and you can detect problems that might be occurring with your counter sooner rather than later. Another option is to go for a longer time period. It's certainly less labor intensive. I would say that longer time period might be quarterly or semi-annually. I wouldn't recommend waiting an entire year to check on your data, just because something can happen to the counter in that time period and you'll miss a lot of counts if you aren't checking on it. So that's something to consider. The other thing is, if you're rotating your counters among several different locations, you want to be considering how often do you want to rotate your counter, and when you rotate your counter, that's a good time to download the data as well. This is a screenshot of EcoCounter's EcoVisio tool, which is how you can download data from their site. They essentially have the counters reporting all the data back to their central computer at EcoCounter, and then they post it online so that you can see whatever counters you have set up in your region. These are Milwaukee area counters that are being monitored, and so you can get the data from these without going into the field. Now, other vendors are likely to have similar types of software like this or online sites, and that's really through contacting them. But this is one that I'm familiar with. So it's nice because you have the ability to check out different time periods and then display data in a variety of different ways. This is just a simple bar graph showing hourly counts over the last month or so along one of our major trails on the east side of Milwaukee. You can also download the data that come from this in a raw format. So what you see here is a table basically showing each hour of the day and the count at each hour. And you can export that using one of their tools, and that can be exported into a spreadsheet. And this spreadsheet then is simple to work with in Excel or whatever spreadsheet program you like. Sometimes the data that you might download from a device in the field might come in a text format, and you'd have to bring those text data into Excel. That's an Excel type of function to do, but it's not particularly difficult once you get the hang of it. So after you've downloaded data, it's important to think about what cleaning might need to be done. Sometimes there are problems with the counter. Particular issues that have happened to me in my experience is getting the sensor blocked. Sometimes a bike gets parked in front of it, or people will be walking back and forth in front of the counter. If you've got it near a bus stop, for example, sometimes milling about happens. The equipment itself might malfunction in terms of power loss. Also, the installation of the device may either be incorrect at the beginning, or it could get shifted around. So that's important to keep aware of. The graph that I'm showing at the bottom there is some data from Berkeley that we had, and during the end of week 2, the eco counter, it was a pyro sensor counting pedestrians along the sidewalk, but it got turned around and pointed towards the street. And so it was counting cars somewhat accurately, somewhat inaccurately for a week before I turned it back around and it got back to the regular pattern. So these are sorts of things that you want to be aware of. Another example of this comes from Arlington County, and when David Patton there, did their counts, they noticed a couple of anomalies in their seasonal patterns. These are their monthly counts along the Custis Trail. February 2010 was a month when there was a massive snowstorm, and so the trail was actually snowed in for a lot of that month, and you had very little bike activity along the trail. That's a regular circumstance that occurs due to a natural event. That's not the sensor malfunctioning. It's just there weren't any bicyclists along the trail for the most part. Contrast that with November 2012, when the device finally had its battery run out, and then they got very low counts in November because of the device having a problem. So it's important to know the difference between the reasons why one count is low and another count is low. The one in red, November 2012, is something that you probably want to make an adjustment to say, here's our best guess at how many bicyclists there were during that time based on previous years or the surrounding months. Whereas February 2010, you wouldn't necessarily want to do that because that's an accurate representation of the number of bicyclists. Okay, so in thinking about that idea, it's important to have local knowledge about anomalies. And there are some methods that you can use to identify problems. You can look at the data just simply hour by hour or day by day, month by month, as I'm showing from the graphs in the previous slides. That's visually inspecting it to see what doesn't look right in terms of the pattern. There are also some more statistical-based methods in looking at essentially the standard deviation of your data at a particular time compared to the previous week when you would have expected a very similar volume. And those are described in our NCHRP report 797. Sean Turner also has a version of this in one reference as well. And we can get more into the details of that if you're interested in that at some point. But more to think about in terms of this is, should the cleaned data be used for analysis? And I think that ultimately you want not your raw data, but you want your cleaned data to be used, to be shared publicly or used for analysis. And to get to clean data, if you've got data that are incorrectly captured, for example, your battery ran out in November, you may want to take data from the time periods before and after and can potentially average those together, or you might impute data from previous or following weeks, for example. I'll just show you a graph that illustrates this better than words. Here there were some problems with the counter one weekend in mid-October, and that weekend had 0 counts. But we know the surrounding weekends, the 26th, 27th of October, 19th and 20th, and then the 5th and 6th, all had somewhat similar patterns. And so we averaged those 3 patterns together to come up with the missing data and essentially imputed that. And so now the pattern would run consistently throughout. Yeah, those are my highlights of the previous and following weeks. So another thing that you want to be thinking about is how accurately is the counter capturing the number of pedestrians and bicyclists who pass by. There's error that is inherent in the process of doing automated counting, and often this is because people cross the counter detection zone at the exact same time. And so if you've got a counter that's a beam coming from the side, somebody's blocked, and we call that occlusion. And so if we really want to have a good estimate of what the actual number of pedestrians or bicyclists is, we can go do a manual count from a video image, which is what we did through the NCHRP 797 project, and compare that with what the automated counter has. And so we were able to come up with accuracies for a variety of counter types. This one is for a graph showing all the data that we collected for a passive infrared sensor. And it shows that if you want to take the count that the sensor has, which is represented by the letter A here in the equations, and get to the true volume, or at least our best estimate of what that true volume is, we could multiply that on average by 1.137. So we're essentially adding 14% to that automated count to come up with an estimate of the true volume of users. So that's one additional thing to be considering to do as part of your cleaning and refining process for the data. Once we've got the data into a form that we think is the best representation of the actual number of pedestrians and bicyclists who passed the sensor, we can then move on to analysis. And there are a lot of different types of analysis, and what you want to do may depend on the purpose. Many people want to quantify volumes at a number of locations throughout their region, give information to local agencies so that they have some sense of what the volumes are in different locations. We also have an interest in tracking changes over time. And so if we have a sensor that's in one location over multiple months or from one year to the next, we can see if our pedestrian and bicycle volumes are increasing. Something else in terms of tracking changes in volume over time that you might want to consider is if you're rotating counters from one location to another, and you do that maybe on every 3 weeks or every month or so, you may want to consider moving your counter back to the same location at some time in the future, so that then you can get an updated count That can also allow you to capture seasonality and changes over multiple years. I'll talk a little bit more about the seasonality issue in a little bit. Also, we may want to identify different types of activity patterns that occur at certain locations and really understand what the variations are during the day from weekday to weekend, from one season of the year to another. And all those types of patterns ultimately can be used to think about what is the overall annual volume at a specific location. So I'll spend a little bit more time on this particular type of analysis, but when we get to the question and answer period, we can certainly talk about some of the other types as well. So expanding the short-term counts to a longer time period is really what we're doing when we're trying to get an estimate of the annualized average daily traffic. And that's a common application, like I said, from the traffic monitoring world. We can do this by expanding short-term counts, which may be collected either manually or using one of your automated counters. And this is a technique that we've described in our NCHRP 797 guidebook. Really, the advantage of automated counters is that we can capture a long-term duration and understand the activity pattern at a certain location very well. The limitation of those automated counters is that they can't count everywhere. We don't have enough budget to put an automated counter up on every segment of every trail or at every sidewalk segment across the region that we'd really want to. But we can collect additional data using field data collectors who do it manually for a short period of time, or by rotating some of the automated counters between multiple locations. And that way we can get better geographic coverage, but we don't have as long-term accounts when we do that. So there's some trade-off, and a good way to overcome those limitations is to use both techniques. And so when you do manual counts, they can capture many different locations. Another advantage of them is that they can count pedestrian and bicyclist characteristics, which many, well, even today, none of the available technologies for automated counting can really capture pedestrian and bicyclist characteristics in terms of gender or helmet use or being in a wheelchair or stuff like that. So they can also count at roadway crossings, which is something that the automated technologies are just starting to touch but don't do as well as manual counters still. The challenges with these manual counts are that they're expensive, of course, and expanding a short-term count to a longer time period, there's inaccuracy involved in that. However, I think that for all of you who have automated counters, it's still worth thinking about how manual counts can supplement your program. You can also do shorter-term counts with automated counters by rotating them and moving a device on a weekly or several weeks basis to be able to get a better understanding of the activity patterns. A challenge of doing this, if you only have your automated counter out for a week during August, for example, and that's the 1 week that you're using to try to understand the patterns, you may not capture all the seasonal variation that occurs during wintertime or early spring. And so one thing to think about is the possibility of rotating that counter back to the same location every 3 months or so. That way you can get a spring, summer, fall, and winter count. That's worth considering. And once you have counts, the short counts, we need to think about how can they be expanded out to the longer time period, such as an annual volume. And the traffic monitoring guide talks about this type of technique. And one of the things that it emphasizes, the concepts, is the idea of factor groups. And this is essentially a way of expanding data based on the assumption that your location is similar to another location where we already know what the pedestrian or bicycle volume pattern is. And One general thought that's being explored in research now, I know Frank Prue is looking at this in his dissertation work, is how are the nearby land uses related to these pedestrian and bicycle activity patterns? I'll talk a little bit more about that near the end. But this is the idea that we're using for factor groups to expand short periods to longer time periods. So to give you a sense of what a factor group is, this is a common sort of pattern that you might see in a location that has a lot of daily commuting, especially commuting to work for 9-to-5 type jobs. When Luis Miranda Moreno and those of us who worked on a paper with him gathered data from 6 different cities around North America, we were able to identify this as one of the common types of patterns. You see around 8 a.m. there's a peak of bicycle activity, and then again around 5 o'clock in the afternoon there's lower volumes during the middle of the day. And we gave a name to this and called it a utilitarian factor group, essentially commute pattern. Contrast this with this type of pattern, which has a very different signature to it. You have a lot more activity in the late morning and early afternoon, but those 2 peaks in the morning and afternoon are not showing up. So this was often on more recreational type facilities. These also had very high volumes on the weekends relative to weekdays. And that's shown in these 2 summary, I'll call them rows. The top row is the primarily utilitarian pattern, and you saw what that looked like. And the weekday up at the upper left-hand corner, that's the pattern that we were showing you, but just simplified here. And then the mixed recreational down at the bottom, you can see how that pattern differs. If you look over to the right side of the screen, the daily profiles show that utilitarian type pattern has lower volumes on the weekends than it does the weekdays. In contrast, the recreational one has higher volumes on the weekend days than weekdays. So how do we use this? Why is this important? I want to give you an example of this. If we wanted to estimate the daily volume of bicyclists based on a 1-hour count, so for example, we counted 100 bicyclists on a Wednesday afternoon from 12 to 1 p.m., how could we expand that out to estimate what the daily volume is? Well, we can use those patterns, and for example, if this is a utilitarian type location, we could say that the noon hour has about 4% of the daily volume. So we divide that 100 by 4% to estimate 2,500 bicyclists. Then if we had a mixed recreational pattern, we would say it has about 8% of the daily pattern, and if we expand that, we can estimate 1,250 bicyclists. Note here that these 2 numbers are very different. The utilitarian pattern yields a number that's twice as big as the recreational pattern. So understanding which pattern is the one to base your expansion off of is critical. And so that's why we spend some time thinking about which pattern is which, and do we have the right pattern for expansion. Taking this a little bit further, I want to use an example from the Milwaukee region and the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission. Joe Delamagori, he's on the call, and he's helped provide some of this data and shared them with me. They're being collected as part of this pilot project. And so I used some of his data as an example. His counts come from the Ozaukee Interurban Trail, which is a location shown on the northern part of this map. I also have some data from the Oakleaf Trail that's in Milwaukee County. That's closer to downtown Milwaukee. And then I've got a manual count, some data that we collected this summer from the intersection of 76th and Bradley in the northwest part of the city of Milwaukee. These 3 locations have different data that go along with them. The counts from the Oakleaf Trail in Milwaukee, we have a full year's worth of data collected from the automated counter, the pyroelectric sensor at the side of the trail. On the Ozaukee Interurban Trail, we had 15 days of data from August. And then at the intersection in the northwest part of Milwaukee, we had 2 hours, just a 2-hour manual count from 4 to 6 p.m. on a Wednesday in June. And I want to look at these 3 sites and figure out, well, how would we estimate the annual volumes at each of them, even though we don't have a full year's worth of data at all 3. We just have the full year's worth of data in Milwaukee. All right, so Milwaukee's Oak Leaf Trail. Here's their beautiful trail, and this is back in the summertime when there are still leaves on the trees. We're actually about to have snow here tonight and tomorrow, so it won't look like this tomorrow. I showed you what happens when you download the data and put it into the spreadsheet. These are the actual data from our Oak Leaf Trail. And I downloaded the data from November 4th, 2014, all the way to November 3rd of 2015. So these are hourly data, hourly counts for all 8,760 hours of the year. They're shown in this spreadsheet from top here to bottom, and I skipped over everything in the middle, but you know it's a full spreadsheet. The next step I did was added some additional columns. What you saw before is now moved over into column F, the data provided by the counter. And I added some simplified versions of the month, weekday, hour of the day, and then hour of the week to make summarizing the data a little bit easier for a variety of purposes. I also made that adjustment for how much the counter would be expected to undercount for every hour. And as I mentioned, to get the actual count, we can multiply for this type of counter by 1.137 to get that estimate. So you can see between columns F and G that I applied that same function. And that's how I got to those numbers in column G. So what I'm going to work with for the analysis is in column G. Now I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom of my spreadsheet. This is where I did the analysis. You could use different programs. You don't have to use Excel to do this, but I thought it was a fairly simple way to do it. I added all those 8,760 hours together to get the total volume for the entire year. So 380,000 pedestrians and bicyclists. These types of, the counter that we have there does not differentiate between the two. This is just total trail users. And from that, we can look at the annualized average daily traffic. So that's essentially dividing that 380,000 by 365 to get 1,040 something. My screen is covering that up. And then we can also look at individual weekdays, take out the weekends, and we actually see that the weekday average and annualized average weekday traffic is lower than the average day because weekends are higher. We can also look at these data in terms of the pattern throughout the week, and that's shown here. I've got the hour of the week along the x-axis. That goes up to 168, and then the average hourly count along the y-axis. And you can see some of those, some characteristics of a commuting pattern. You've got a morning peak. The afternoon peak is much bigger, but the morning peak is there. And then there are some characteristics of recreational pattern here too, in that the weekend actually has higher volumes on this at this location than the weekdays. Looking at this from a seasonal perspective, we see that July has the highest average hourly counts, and we see a very strong seasonal pattern. The winter has much less use of the trail, so there's still people out there during the winter time. If we look on an annual basis, the average hourly traffic for this location is 43 users per hour. That includes every hour of the day, including the middle of the night. One thing to keep in your mind as I move forward is that some months have higher than the annual average traffic and some have lower. and we can use that information to do seasonal adjustments on our data. For example, June is, the counts in June are on average 1.69 times higher than the average throughout the year. So keep that 1.69 in mind. Now, I'm going to move to the Ozaukee Interurban Trail and Joe's data. SEWRPC has summarized some neat statistics over on the left side of the spreadsheet. They also point out something at this location. So on the right side, they've got a picture of the count location and then the map showing where it is. That's really handy. You can see it's not in the middle of the city. It's just south of Cedarburg. You would expect it to be a little bit more of a recreational type location. And one thing that they also pointed out was on Saturday, August 29th, it was a rainy day. And that's interesting because the volumes on the 29th were much lower than they were the previous Saturday. And so it brings up the question, what do you do about a rainy day when you have your counter out there and you're recording much lower volumes? This is an example from Minneapolis. They clearly showed a relationship between rainy days and less volume. We saw that in our data here in Milwaukee. You can see in the column where I've highlighted the rainy day, rain suppressed volumes on August 29th. These are the adjusted volumes compared to column K, which I essentially took the previous Saturday, those volumes, and put them next to the ones in the rainy day volume. So you can see at best the rainy day was about 25% of the hourly count on a regular Saturday. And so really, should you use the rainy day volumes? And what I would say is that it's good practice if you're trying to get some sense of the annual volume to still include the data with the rainy day in there, because real years include rainy days. They're not all sunny, beautiful September days. They have weather that occurs within them. And if you really want to get a true estimate of the annual volume, you need to capture that rainy day as a part of the full year. But if you have another purpose where you just want to show what the pattern was over the previous week or two, you may want to say, well, on a typical day, we would expect this regular Saturday pattern. And so it really depends on your purpose for the data. But if you're going to the full annual estimate, I would recommend including the rainy days as they show up. So going back to our data for this trail, how can we estimate the annual volume for it? And one option is to assume that the seasonal volume patterns on the Oakleaf Trail, the one down in Milwaukee, is the same as the Ozaukee County Interurban Trail. So we have the entire year's worth of data for the Milwaukee counter, but not for the other one. The Ozaukee one, which only has essentially 2 weeks of data, we have a total count of 7,452 users. We can compare that with the exact same hours from the Oakleaf Trail in Milwaukee and then make our comparison of those two. So if you go back to the trail in Milwaukee, we have 25,697 during that time period, and that represents 6.8% of the entire yearly volume. And so essentially we can just say that this 7,452 for the Ozaukee Trail represents 6.8% of that annual volume, and use that to estimate what the full year's volume would be. Showing you here. So we divide the 7,452 by 0.068. That gives us an estimate of about 110,000 users for the entire year. Of course, this is assuming that these two trails have very similar overall patterns of activity. We don't know any better without having the automated counter out out on the Ozaukee Interurban Trail for a longer time period. So this is the best estimate that we can do with the data that we have. So I want to go to the example of the intersection at 76th and Bradley, where we've got a 2-hour manual count from June. And what should we do with that? So one option there is to use the exact same idea that we did for the Ozaukee Interurban Trail and apply that seasonal adjustment. So we can take the 2 hours of the year from the Oak Leaf Trail and essentially expand those out and estimate the yearly volume. Of course, that may not be the best estimate because there's a whole lot more variation that can occur in just a 2-hour period relative to having 2 weeks worth of data. So another thing to consider is to try to identify locations that have similar hourly and daily patterns and then apply their patterns to expand the counts that we have manually for 2 hours at 76th and Bradley. And so here's how that can be done. I showed you before this graph of the weekly volume pattern along the Oak Leaf Trail. Here we see that if we have our count from 76th and Bradley, which is a 4 to 6 p.m. count on a weekday, that time period would represent about 3.13% of the overall weekly volume. So we would take that count of 27 and expand it to the weekly count using that number. Now, if 76th and Bradley is more similar to the Ozaukee Interurban Trail, we might actually want to use that pattern instead. And so I'll just flip back and forth between these for a second. To be fair, I've exaggerated the differences between these two patterns because the y-axis is on a slightly different scale. But we know that 76th and Bradley, if we applied the Ozaukee Interurban Trail pattern to that location, it would be only representing 1.71% of the weekly volume. So you can see we're going to get different estimates from assuming different patterns here. So here's how we would do that. Sorry, Jeremy, was that you? Okay, sorry. To apply these, we look at the Oak Leaf Trail weekly pattern and divide that count of 27 by the 3.13% to get an estimate of 863 users per week, and then multiply that 863 by 52. So that would get us an annual estimate. But we need to account for the fact that June has higher volumes than other times of the year. So this is where we're dividing by that 1.69, which is essentially a seasonal factor or a monthly factor for June. That gives us an annual volume estimate of 26,600 at the Oak Leaf Trail location. At 76th and Bradley using the Oak Leaf Trail pattern assumption. If we use the Ozaukee Interurban Trail pattern assumption, we would get an estimate of 48,700 users per year. So it's really important to figure out which one is appropriate for that location. And this is the last part that I want to consider. This is starting to get more into the technical side and also more into where research is these days. We are still working on trying to come up with good objective ways to classify volume patterns. And I showed you the two types before, very distinct types of utilitarian and recreational. The reality is that not all locations fit perfectly into either one of these. There's some gradation in between, and there might even be other patterns that exist based on land use activities nearby. But one way to look at these objectively is to compare some parts of the patterns that are very distinct. And the areas that I'm highlighting there, I want to just give more specific definitions to. So we, as a part of the paper that I was discussing before, came up with two types of indices. One is the weekend to weekday index, the WWI, and that takes the average weekend day volume and divides it by the average weekday volume. And then the second one is the AMI, the AM peak to midday index. And so it takes that ratio. So going back to the previous slide, on the right, using the daily profile, the differences between those two patterns that's illustrating two different WWIs, or sorry, the weekend to weekday index. In the case of the utilitarian pattern, the weekend is lower than the weekday. In the recreational one, the weekend is higher than the weekday. For the AMI, the AM peak to midday index, that's shown on the left side of the screen. And we can see that for the utilitarian pattern, it has a high AM peak relative to the midday, and then the recreational has a low AM peak relative to the midday. So that's how we're using statistics to try to differentiate between the types of patterns. And once you have the type of location decided, then you can apply the appropriate pattern to the counts that you have. So as I said, this is still a work in progress, but this is one way to think about it. Here's a summary of the utilitarian, low WWI, high AMI, recreational, high WWI, and low AMI. But another way to think about it, and this is where we're trying to eventually get land use to match up with the AMI and WWI, is that the factor groups are related to the surrounding land uses in some way. And so if you don't have any information beyond just your 2-hour counts, for example, at 76th and Bradley, we don't know what the daily pattern looks like or how the weekdays might compare to the weekend. So we would probably want to use the surrounding land use to say, well, is 76th and Bradley more like the Oakleaf Trail, or is it more like the Ozaukee Interurban Trail pattern? And this is something that SEWRPC can debate and talk about. One thought that I have is that it might be more like the Oakleaf Trail because it's still in a part of the city of Milwaukee. It's not in a rural area, but it's in a more, there's residential and industrial sites up there, which is somewhat similar to the area that's closer to downtown. Whereas the Ozaukee Interurban Trail is much more in a rural area, and it's just south of a small town. So I might not use the Ozaukee Interurban Trail pattern to expand the volumes at 76th and Bradley. So with that, I want to open the call for questions about what I was presenting, first of all, and then soon after that we can talk more about some progress that you've been making, challenges, opportunities, what's going well so far, and answer some of these questions. But first, I guess I want to ask if you have any questions about what I covered specifically in my presentation. So can we open up the lines?
Hey, Bob.
Yeah, hey, Carl.
So, yeah, thanks. Great presentation. There are a couple questions that are were typed in, and why don't we start with those, and then we can go ahead and open up the phone lines.
Yeah, sounds good.
I'm sorry.
Do you have them,
Jeremy?
Yeah, I've got the questions up. So why don't I just read out the questions from Mark Farrell, hopefully pronouncing the name right. He can correct me later. Do expansion factors for occlusion need to be determined per site, or are there general factors to use?
Yeah, good question. So there are general factors from our NCHRP 797 report. So if you download that online, you can see what those are for particular device types. However, if you do want to get even more sophisticated about it, it's best if you can come up with an estimate of what the undercounting is at your particular location, since the sensitivity of a counter might be slightly different, or the setup at your particular site might be slightly different than what we tested. But for a general purpose, just applying those that we have from the 797 report should be a good start.
Great, thanks, Bob. From David Henderson, it seems like you need the 24-hour profile to determine if it is utilitarian or recreational.
So that's what I was starting to get into at the end, and it's a really fundamental sort of question. If you do have the pattern over at least 24 hours, you can start to see whether it's utilitarian or recreational, fitting into those two broad categories. But there's some locations where you might not have a count that goes for that long. And so this is where I'm saying it's useful to consider the surrounding land use. So if you're right in an area that's where a lot of commuters who go to downtown, a trail that leads right into the downtown area and has what you would know intuitively to be a lot of weekday commuting, then you'd probably want to apply that utilitarian pattern at that location. So there's some intuition that goes with it still if you don't have the data to show what the pattern actually is. Ultimately, it's best if you can get at least a day or a few days worth of data so that you can understand quantitatively that pattern. But most communities aren't that far along yet.
Okay, great. Thanks. From Gabriela Arismendi, what if we don't have a full year count to compare to our shorter counts?
Right. So that's something that over time you'll eventually be able to get a full year's worth of counts, either by having one counter set up for an entire year, or by rotating a counter back to the same location and seeing what the seasonal patterns are, and then ultimately kind of imputing the data in between those count periods to account for the entire year. So once you have that, then you can get your best estimate of the annual volumes. With that said, there are a number of communities that have faced this issue already, and so the National Documentation Project, for example, has seasonal adjustment factors that they've come up with based on a number of locations around the country. And so if you just have a couple of weeks worth of counts or a full month worth of counts, and you have that from, let's say, October, you can then apply the monthly factors that they've come up with and then estimate your annual volume from that. There may be some other sources besides the National Documentation Project that have monthly factors, but that's one that you could start with. Ultimately, it's best if you can develop your own, because the seasonal patterns in different parts of the country are very different due to very different weather patterns.
Okay, great. Gabriella has a follow-up question to that. We'll get back to that in a minute. I'm just going to keep working these in order. From Francesca Taylor, did you use the peak period to extrapolate data for a longer period of time?
So yes, you ideally want to use the peak period because the peak period will have higher volumes, which tend to have less variation in them. And so if you can use a more stable base for your estimate, that's better. I'll just make that a little bit more concrete by saying the 76th and Bradley example that I gave, that 4 to 6 p.m. is roughly an afternoon peak hour period, we could have taken a count from midnight at that location, and it could vary between 0 and 5 people, which is a high amount of variation, and then expand based on midnight. But that's going to give a much worse estimate than if you do it at the peak time of 4 to 6. So estimating using the peaks as your base is the best way to go.
Okay, here's an interesting question that you may want to be diplomatic with. This is Gabriella's follow-up question. Is EcoCounter's extrapolation methodology better than that of the National Biped Documentation Project? Whoops.
Well, I guess I'll be diplomatic and say that I haven't tried EcoCounters, so I don't actually know. But it's something that you could explore and try them both out and compare them. Then tell us all what you thought.
Right. I mean, that would be a fine thing to investigate, and I'd encourage any of you who come up with little tidbits of investigation like that to consider throwing it into your whatever reports you generate as part of this project.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Go on.
Sorry, I was going to say this is kind of the cutting edge of where the research is, and so what you guys are doing by having counters out there and being able to compare some of these methods is going to be really helpful.
Right. I mean, we'll be asking a lot of questions about this data and other data that you and others collect later on. Julie Walkoff asks, I can see understanding commuter transportation data by time of day and so on as described, but how can you say people traveling in irregular patterns are purely recreational without some sort of intercept survey?
Yeah, so the term recreational is an imperfect one for sure. Especially because you have a variety of purposes on the let's just say Saturday afternoon. People may be not just out there for exercise; they may be going to social activities, or some of them may be going to work in the afternoon. That's just a term that we came up with for that particular activity pattern that was generally seen. It's not. If we can come up with something better, that's certainly something to strive for in the future. I'll say that.
Great, thanks. All right, that gets to the bottom of the list of typed questions, and I think it's time now to have our organizer folks behind the scenes throw the lines open so people who have had trouble typing their comments in, we can actually have some verbal discussion now. So even if you've been typing, feel free at this point. And I think, Bob, did you have specific questions you wanted to sort of toss out for people?
Yeah, I do.
Let me just
go ahead.
Before Bob, I just want to I'm going to open the lines, but just as a reminder for everyone, since I am opening the lines, to make sure that your phone is muted, or your microphone, or whatever you're using, so we don't get any of the background noise. Okay, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is that if we could first, if there are any other questions about the topics that I was covering in my presentation, let's take those first, and then maybe in 5 or 10 minutes we can move forward to the other questions that I have more about how things are going so far in your region. I guess I'll just maybe add to that question a little bit and ask it more generally, what's going well so far for those of you who've gotten your counters out? This is the second bullet down. Has there been some really good stuff happening? Have you gotten good feedback from people? So what's going well?
Hello?
All right.
Hey, this is Gabby, Metroplan. I guess I'll start off. The way that it has worked out on our side is going very well. I think the best thing is that we have gotten a lot of support from our local jurisdictions. It's been a little bit of a snowball effect where At first, they didn't know why we wanted to do this, and now they're asking for our help in the sense that they now have projects and that they want to do before-after counts, and they come to us and ask for it, which then turns into a little bit of a negative, because if I had already developed an annual calendar of where my counters were going to go, and so how can you say no to my local mayors who are asking, like, hey, can you put a counter in my location for the month of December? So it kind of threw off our calendar for a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a very real issue that a lot of MPOs face, just because you're representing local governments too, and you got to respond to their needs. I'm just curious, Joe, I think you're probably on the phone. Is that something that's happened here in southeastern Wisconsin too? Yeah, maybe Joe's not on, or he's on mute right now. So.
I'll see you in a little bit. Probably.
Hey Bob, this is Dan Goodman. I've got a question. If we have a minute now.
Sure.
Okay. Can you? I thought the part of your presentation where you're talking about sort of documenting or figuring out how to deal with imperfect data and cleaning it to a point where you can actually use it in analysis. Can you say a little bit about kind of the role of documenting those decisions and how that changes based on, you know, whether you're planning on writing a paper for TRB versus standing in front of the city council trying to, you know, present data or advocate for more funding for a trail project? How do you recommend people actually document those decisions that they're making along the way to deal with the issues that we know come up when we do this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, just to say that you have documented changes that you've made to raw data is a very important thing to do. It's certainly important to do in the academic world, but also in, you know, practical presentations to stakeholders. If you can say, well, we didn't just take the data that we got from the counter as it came right off of it. We actually thought carefully to make sure that it represented our best estimate of what's actually occurring out there. Then it's going to build your credibility to be able to make a convincing argument with the data. Now, I think that there's some basic things to document. One is whenever the counter might not be getting a count that is that's accurate because of some version of mechanical failure or problems with installation. So those are good things to document. You know, keep a Word document or a spreadsheet or something like that to say, well, we had these problems on these 2 specific days, and so we're going to throw that Friday, and that we aren't going to throw the data out, but we're going to use some version of imputing data from other time periods to replace those data, and here's how we did it. So that's one type of data cleaning issue to document. Another one is to document the anomalies that may have occurred due to, you know, major weather event. You know, I was showing you the rain example from here, but there could also be other events, like if you've got a counter out on a trail and there's a big recreational ride or a marathon or something like that that uses the trail one Saturday, it's really important to be able to document why that spike in data occurs. And so the spike in counts, you document that somewhere, and you leave that in your data, but you show why it's an anomaly in the overall pattern. So those sorts of things, if you document them, I think it makes your presentation of the data stronger. Does that get at what you're saying, Dan?
Yeah, totally. That's helpful to sort of clarify that, because I do think that that's just going to be really helpful for everybody and all the people that are participating in the pilot, that we're all remembering to do that along the way.
Yeah,
because I know it's very hard sometimes to, when you're in the heat of the moment processing data, sometimes it's hard to remember what you did 2 months ago and what assumptions you made.
Right.
But that, as far as our kind of big picture, what we're hoping to get out of the pilot experience overall, that kind of detail is going to be really, really helpful for us. So.
Yeah, so the sooner you can do it after it happens or after you recognize it, the better. It's kind of like doing a time sheet and writing down what you did.
Yep. Thank you.
Yep. So I guess along the lines of the first, or what Gabby was saying, has there been a positive reaction from your local agencies within your regions about these counting efforts? Do you have any stories about that, about how the locals are reacting?
This is Christine with Fresno Cog. I think our program has been going well so far, and we have many cities in the county, many jurisdictions are very interested in actually getting the counter and set up count locations in our cities, and we just don't have enough money to buy enough counters for that. So we can only give each count location 2 weeks. So the cities are very excited about the technology. And then I would like to add that we have eco counters, and I think they're very helpful in our experience so far. So using their website, using their equipment, and we have one counter that's kind of was not working, and they replaced it immediately. So far we have very positive experience with the program.
That's great. Have you shared any of the data with the local agencies that you've collected them for?
Yes.
Have they seen the output so far?
Yes. So eco counters have helped us create different accounts. One is master account that all the cities can view everybody else's account location, the account information, and they can also edit. The other account is they can edit their own data. They can go in and check, whether the account is working well, and then they can edit the data themselves online.
That's great. So yeah, if you just had more money to get some more counters.
Yes.
I'm guessing that others have had this issue too.
Actually, several cities have expressed interest in getting more counters themselves now that they have used it and find it easy to use, and so.
That's great. And would they, if they buy their own counter, would they be willing to share the data with you guys as well, so that you could have somewhat of a regional repository for the data?
Well, it has always been our tradition to share data. They always share data with us.
That's great. Great. Have others had good or challenging experiences with their locals?
Hey, this is Gabby again. Just sort of on that same discussion. So right after we purchased ours for the MPO, City of Orlando also purchased. They purchased 2 counters, eco counters as well. And what I really liked about the whole entire eco counter system is that actually City of Orlando gave us access to their data. So they made us a login and everything, so we can go in and check out what has been happening on their side of the counters, and then we can report it back at our MPO meetings. if we needed to. Usually they do it, but in whatever case. And so we have done the same thing where we have given them access to our counters. I've actually done that with all of my cities. Obviously limited access, but at least they can go in and check out the the 3 counters that we have assigned to Seminole County. They can go in and see where they're at and how many people and so forth.
Great, great. I'm curious if anybody has a non-eco counter technology, and if they're working with a different vendor, how is data sharing working? Is that same sort of website download available, or do you have to go through other types of applications to do that?
Hi, this is Sarah Rhodes with the Richmond TPO. We're using JMAR tube counters, which have been really great for doing our mixed traffic counts. We've been able to pick up quite a bit of data. The one sort of downside is that tubes have about a 30-day life, and then after that you start to risk the tube counters, and they can get pretty beat up and not provide the most accurate data. The data that we have gotten, I took a look at it again this morning in prepping for this discussion, is really, really great, and it gives us quite a variety of insight into just the overall traffic that's in the roadway from our count locations. So it is really great. I am not all that technology friendly, and so I have a lot of trouble with some basic technology things. And the way I kind of see it is EcoCounter is sort of like using an iPhone or an iPad. It's very accessible, really simple interface. JMAR has a lot more sort of technical hoops to jump through, but you get, a lot more data flexibility if you know how to use the software. If you can kind of intuit the analysis and approach, it's really much more flexible. You get a lot more out of it. But it has been something that's been a bit of a struggle for me. However, it is, terrific, robust data. So.
Great, great. That is really good to hear about some other technologies that are available. And I'm just curious if you mentioned that the tubes you've got in mixed traffic, so cars are running over them and bikes are running over them?
Yep.
And so it differentiates between those two.
Yes, it classifies. I mean, it differentiates between motorcycles and bikes. It's very, it does so based on the sort of when the first wheels hit the first tube and then the time it takes to hit the second tube. And then I think there's some technical component with the weight. I'm not quite sure on the details, but yeah, it can classify all the vehicles that use it, which was actually a bit humorous when we did our first download, because we were looking at total counts per hour and we were getting 150, 160. We were like, there are so many bicycles going over these counters, and then we realized that when you classify it, bike traffic is actually about 16-20% of that overall traffic. So
still, they're out there.
Yep.
And so since you said they have a life of about 30 days, and I assume that depends on the automobile traffic volume, what's the volume of the road for autos that you've got the counter out on?
We're in a city environment, an urban environment, but it's pretty much a neighborhood street. So when we looked at counting in that location, our statewide counts showed that sort of avenue as having less than 5,000 vehicles a day, which is coming up about right with our counts. So if you're on a higher traffic corridor, those tubes might deteriorate more quickly. Our tubes deteriorated within the 30-day time frame, but not because I think of the wear and tear from traffic going over them. We were with mixed traffic, and there was parking along the street, and we couldn't, for a lot of different reasons, we couldn't block off parking, or, well, we just didn't block off parking. It's a very long story, but we were concerned the residents might revolt. So we basically, with that, cars parked on the tubes, and the initial nail down for where the tube meets the road right before it hits the counter, we have cuts along our tubes at that location because of cars parking on them. So they might have lasted a bit longer because our travel lane was such low volume, long story short.
Yeah, oh, neat. That's great. Is anybody else using tubes? I'm just curious as far as technologies go.
Hello? Yes, yeah. The Palm Beach MPO, we just started our count about a week and a half ago. We are using tube counters and the pyro boxes for pedestrian counts. In one location, we did have an incident where one of the tubes kind of snapped. So the tube isn't broken. We can still use it, but it did supply a false count. At least it's continued to count in one direction at least, but we wanted to have the directional count. With that said, we'll have to redeploy for that location to see what the more accurate count would be. Yeah, yeah, and when you used your tubes and you said you're using the pyro boxes too, are you using those at the same location and getting bicyclists versus pedestrians, or are those at different locations? Where we can, we are using them at the same location. It really depends on if there are poles available. There are some instances where there may be a pole, but it won't allow the pyro box to emit its laser towards the sidewalks. We wouldn't be able to count pedestrians. So where possible, we are deploying both sets of equipment at the same place. But even then, we're trying to deploy the tubes across the sidewalk and within the bike lane, so that we can get an idea of how many people are actually biking on the sidewalk and biking on the bike lane. And that's really helpful when we have both pieces of equipment out there. We can better get an understanding of how that, if that's happening. Wow, that's interesting. Let me see if I've heard you right on this. So with the tube, you've got the same tube going in the bike lane and up onto the sidewalk? Yes, where possible. And then we'll have a pyro box that will count the pedestrians or cyclists, in that matter, on the sidewalk. So we'll be able to look at the numbers. And this is kind of being hopeful. We're still getting the numbers in, because we're still kind of early in the process. But the hope is that when we get the numbers in, we'll be able to differentiate who was biking on the sidewalk versus who was biking in the bike lane. That's a really neat idea. If you can at some point, if you have a picture of your installation, it'd be neat to see what that looks like, because I don't think I've ever seen one tried just like that before. I'm not sure if anybody else has, but that's a neat idea. Okay. So I know Joe Delamagori, he was muted when I was asking him about the his connections with the local agencies around here. Joe, I want to give you a chance, since I think you're unmuted now, if there's some stuff you want to add about what's going on here in southeastern Wisconsin.
Sure. Bob, can you hear me now?
Yes, we got you.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. So yeah, to kind of follow up on that, we've had the opportunity to go to most of the counties in our area, and what I've gotten the habit of doing is alerting the local entity that owns the particular trail, and I let them know the days that we're going to be out there, and then I provide the data to them after the fact. Everybody that I've worked with so far has been very receptive and actually welcoming of the data. They've really appreciated it. We actually had one county maybe a couple months ago that had heard about this and was anxious to get some counts on some of their trails. So I was contacted by them, and was able to work their trails into my kind of summer-fall count schedule here and everything. So yeah, in terms of communication with the local communities, things have been going very well. Like others, we also have the EcoCounter Pyro Box and have been putting them out on the trails throughout the area. They work really well in those environments. Data, we've got it coming through automatically, so every day about either I'm checking the data or my interns are, just to make sure that there was no issues from the previous day. And I guess maybe one challenge that we've faced is really just not getting enough calibration or validation of the counts. We just did one recently, and I realized we probably should have been doing this a little more frequently, but we have recognized that the counter is undercounting. And the couple hours that we did, we were realizing that there was, somewhere between 20 and 40% of undercounting. Now, obviously, that was a small sample, but it does kind of show that there is some limitations to those devices. And so we're hoping to be a little more aware of that here forthcoming, and maybe seeing what we can do to adjust the data.
Great to know. That's interesting in terms of undercounting, and to a certain extent, some of it may be due to occlusion, but there could also be some sensitivities of the device, or maybe how the device was angled or something like that, that would be contributing to additional undercounting. But I think what you just said there is really important for everybody to consider. Don't take our word from the previous study to be gospel about what exactly the undercount is. It's best to go out and do some validation counts at sites, at least for each technology that you're using, so you can see locally how is your device working. And maybe you have a different adjustment factor that you apply, not the adding 14%, but maybe you need to add 18% or add only 10%. So that's a really good lesson. And Joe, I'm just curious, since I was showing some of your data as the example, I was wondering if you have any plans to move one of those counters back to the Ozaukee Interurban Trail, that same location, during a different season to maybe capture some of the seasonality on that trail. Or maybe you don't have enough resources to get back there because you need to cover all 7 counties. But I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, we're actually going to do that location on the Ozaukee Interurban here probably right after Thanksgiving for that purpose, to kind of see, now that we're moving into more of the winter weather, the colder weather, and just being able to see if there's any potential change. So yeah, that counter is going to go out at that location here pretty soon.
Great, great. And one last question for you. So in working with locals, I know that you're sharing the EcoCounter summary data with people from each county after you do the counts. And I'm wondering if there have been other people besides me who've been interested in getting the hourly data and digging into it more, or if really the summary data is what they're most interested in, the raw numbers, daily, weekly, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, primarily people have just been accepting of the hourly summaries, or I'm sorry, the daily summaries, but the Racine County, some of the folks there have contacted me asking for the hourly data. Racine County is the county just south of Milwaukee County, for those who don't know, and we were able to do a couple of sessions on 2 of their trails out in that area, and so they've actually been the only ones other than you, Bob, to ask for the hourly data.
I'm glad that somebody else is as nerdy as I am. No, this is good stuff. Also, it brings up the idea that those of you who have been doing some counts, you may want to get in touch with some of your local universities, because there may be students who are looking for class projects or researchers who want to dig into the data a little bit more, and you've got some fresh stuff for them to look at. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind.
Right, and this is Jeremy, and I'll sort of add also that as you accumulate counts, you may want to let me know that you've got some data. And if you're interested in trying to get that data in front of somebody who's doing research in this area to help you figure out what it means or take a look at it, we could probably work something like that out as well. While I'm talking, I'll also mention that there's one other written question we haven't addressed yet from David Henderson, who asked, are there standard formats for reporting this kind of data? And I'm going to toss that back to you, Bob, even though I could answer part of that question, to say standards for reporting not just the raw information, let's say. I'm going to embellish the question here a little bit, but also reporting certain types of summaries or certain particular segments of time which seem to be standard ways of going about this for any purposes.
Oh yeah, oh boy, it's a whole area of, there's probably a whole other guidebook on that. The TMAS work that you've been involved with, Jeremy, I'll let you fill in more details on that, but the Federal Highway Administration has been coming up with sort of standards for reporting the very core data that you may have from your particular locations. I think that beyond core data, in terms of just the basic location information, the X and Y latitude, longitude coordinates, and then the count by hour, the type of counter, if it has directionality or not, those sorts of basic things. Beyond those, you may also want to think about recording other characteristics around the site for your own purposes, especially as we get into these issues of figuring out the factor group. So you might want to document some information about land use characteristics near your trail or your other count site and say, well, this is a very urban site, this is a mixed-use suburban site. And that way you'll have it documented for when you move your counter to a variety of other locations. That reminds me of, I'll just say one other thing. For those of you who are rotating counters from one location to another, make sure you're documenting exactly when you move the counter, what hour of the day, what day was it, so that you make sure you can get the right data with the right location. It's a very basic thing when you're talking about it, but when you actually have to go out and do it, and if you forget to write that down, you will potentially miss a bunch of counts because you haven't documented it carefully enough. So always record where the location is and when you move the sensors. Jeremy, I want to have you give more on TMAS though.
Right. Yeah. Let me actually follow up on that. The basis that we're trying to establish at Federal Highway, in much the same way that we've been pushing this for motorized counts, is to lean on data formats that we document in a book called the Traffic Monitoring Guide. You could actually go out on the internet and look up TMG for Traffic Monitoring Guide and then FHWA, and that takes you pretty close to the homepage for it, if you haven't already seen it. There's a chapter there that resembles the NCHRP report on counting methodologies, but there's also a chapter in Chapter 7 that includes the bicycle and pedestrian formats. We've had a lot of feedback on those formats from people in the field, and I will mention that there is a contract underway now with the original developers of that format to enhance it so that we have better support for things that people are likely to be counting, mostly in manual counts, things like helmet usage, age of cyclist, sex of cyclist, and things like that. We're also working on a number of, or actually on one particular project, to try and provide more user-friendly guidance to people who are trying to collect enough information so that we can have a standard reporting of counts. And one of the things that I'm hoping to do with the data that some of you, or hopefully all of you, will end up sending back to us at Federal Highway as part of this project will be to look at the kinds of things that are stored in the data and the challenges that we face, so that as we go forward with that gradual standardization process over the next 2 or 3 years, we can really see what people are up against out in the field and start to understand some of the problems. So there will be a lot more guidance on that developing over the next year or so, and improvements in the format itself. But that's kind of where we're going. This is such a new field, relatively speaking, that we really don't have good traction with vendors of equipment We've talked to all of them, and we will continue those conversations to try and get them to support more directly the format that we're trying to develop, and I think there'll be a back and forth on that over time. But that's essentially the project that we're going after with that, and you know, we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, and if we just thinking more broadly, on the research side, if we have really good data that is in a consistent format from different parts of the country, that allows us to do some powerful analysis and see, you know, what are the differences in pedestrian and bicycle increases from one community to another. You know, can we look in at specific location types and compare them across regions? A lot can be done with this if we've got a good, consistent way of sharing the data.
Right, and I'll add on to that one other thing, for example, that many people would like to be able to do is make judgments in advance of investing in particular facilities or improvements to get a sense of what impact that would have on demand. And as we get this kind of information, we can start looking at consistent influential factors, and we can also give people guidance about what sort of information they should collect in advance. And one of the things that we've tried to do with these models in the past, or these kinds of estimating techniques, is to identify static characteristics of the land use, look at the demographics. But we may be able to learn a lot even by putting down portable counters for a month or two ahead of time when we're looking at a corridor and trying to evaluate it. And if we can give people guidance on what sort of count information or other supporting information give you the best chance of estimating the effects of that facility, that's something that we have great hopes for as well. I mean, that kind of thing is often done with motorized traffic models, and we'd really like to get to the same place with the non-motorized estimation tools also.
Yeah, so Dave, did we answer your question adequately? All right, Dave may be on mute or be muted still. So I just wanted to ask, I guess, the last question on my list, and that's, what are you hoping to learn from your counts? It sounds like so far there's definitely interest from local agencies within your regions just to get some better counts of pedestrians and bicyclists, like how many people are out there, and to compare between locations for sure. But have any other ideas come to mind of how you could apply the data, and either from you at the MPO or from any of your locals who are interested in seeing certain applications or using the data in a certain way? So I'm just curious so far, you know, what you're looking to learn.
Our deployment is going along well in Buffalo, Niagara, and our initial interest in what we want the information for is to document before and after on complete streets, as our city has a pretty comprehensive complete streets policy. So I think we can use this initially to do that, and also in calibration of some of our microsimulation models too, because we do have all those attributes in microsimulation. We're using two different technologies that aren't tubes, the Grid Smart fisheye camera PED detecting unit, which moves around, and then the micro-radar bicycle detection units. So I think we'll have a couple different technologies to be able to show you what they were able to do. We also have historically done manual counts, so I think we have a good feel for the data management and calibration aspect of it, and we'll be able to probably dual some of these locations with manual counts and see how they stack up.
Excellent. Are you thinking about the techniques for expanding those manual counts out to annual volumes, or doing some of that too, the factoring?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, great. You mentioned a fisheye type camera?
Yeah.
And do you have that, is that at like segment locations between intersections, or is that actually something for intersection counting too?
It's at intersections, yeah.
Oh, neat. I guess, so I'm not...
Yeah, the vendor talked about other places where they deployed them. They actually put them on a mobile unit and just moved them around to, you could put it on a segment or an intersection. Right now we're putting on an intersection pole, but then you can just move it where you want.
And what is the specific movement that they're counting? Are they like counting all pedestrians and crosswalks, for example?
Yes.
Neat, neat. And who is the vendor on that?
That would be GridSmart.
Okay, GridSmart. Another one to put on my list to check into.
Yep. And it's live, so we can start looking at the data remotely. It went live 2 hours and 32 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
So since you mentioned that you're doing some evaluation of your complete streets policy there, what were the locations that you chose, and was there some rationale to try to represent different parts of the city or the region?
Yeah, actually, when we looked at the different intersections or the different corridors to count on, we looked at corridors that have had a transition where there's been some infrastructure improvements to make it a more complete street, or are actually up for some type of improvements in the next couple of years. So we'll have that data as a baseline.
Great, great. And so it is really targeted towards before and after on particular corridors.
Yeah.
Very neat. Does anybody else have a device set up in a location that they have future plans to improve, or where there's upcoming projects?
Here in Fresno, we have a pedestrian mall, food mall. So we are putting the counters at that location before and after project. The mall has not been doing well, so the city has a plan to bring back traffic. So now they're doing before the project to count the pedestrian and bicycle list, and after they're going to do counts after they bring traffic in. So that will be an interesting. It will be very interesting to see whether they're going to have more people actually shopping at the mall because they introduce traffic. This is part of the downtown revitalization effort.
Sure, that is a really interesting question, and good to have some data on. Yeah. And when are they making the change?
They have got a Tiger grant. So all the money is in place. I think it's going to, the construction is going to start sometime next year, I think. So in a year or two, they're going to have that completed.
So you could potentially have a year's worth of before data.
Well, we only can give them 2 weeks of time for the county.
Okay. All right. But that's one of the sites that you've got to put the counters out at.
Right now, and the city already told us that they want to have the counters back at that same location when the project is completed.
Right, great. Does anybody else using the counters for a different type of purpose that we may not have thought about or been talking about so far? All right, that seems like we're probably covering that pretty well.
Yeah. And I would say I think we had promised people a 2:30 cutoff, although there's a little ambiguity because we generally block out 2 hours for this. I would say probably we should aim, just in the interest of respecting people's time, to begin wrapping this up. I did have one more technical question in the chat pod from Mark, who was asking about whether we needed more data to validate two counters that are being used in mixed traffic compared to what you would do to validate counts taken in other conditions or with other technology.
That's a good question. I wouldn't say that there would necessarily need to be more, but if you can do some validation, the more data you collect, the more accurate your understanding of the undercounting will be. That's a general answer, but I think that's where we're at.
Okay. Thanks for that, Bob. And I guess before we shut this off completely, if there's anybody who feels they need to speak up, this would be the moment to do it.
Hey everybody, this is Joe in Milwaukee. Just I guess one more quick question to clarify. Next month there's the discussion about having the initial count delivery. Can you just verify, is that like you want us to provide you all of the count data that we've collected up to this point? And
well, as I've said from the beginning, I mean, I'm not trying to sort of strong arm anybody with this stuff. If you feel that you have, and you can deliver up raw data, the stuff you downloaded from the counters, the key application that we have for that those counts now is that we'd like to start building up a set of what you see from counters in the field that we can use internally to help with the development of the traffic monitoring analysis system database that we're building nationally, and to get a feel for what sorts of problems or issues might come up with that data and how to recognize that. So we have kind of our own research agenda for that. Really, as with all of this, we'd like you to give us feedback on what you're experiencing as you go through this project, and we would like to see some of the data that you've collected when you finally get that far. So that's pretty much it. And so I don't want to sort of come down hard and say, yes, I want to see in dollars and cents in terms of every every count that you've collected along the way. But that's as much as you care to share with us, that would be wonderful, and I'll be happy to take as much as you want to send in my direction. Cool. Well, hearing nothing else, I'd like to thank everyone for their participation and for the rather excellent discussion I thought that we had afterwards on some of these issues. I believe that we'll try to squeeze in one more webinar before the end of the year, and we'll have some more information on that probably right after Thanksgiving. So keep posted for that. In the meantime, do remember that we've got the Google group where you can ask questions for feedback from any of our technical support team. If you'd like to get in touch with somebody personally, feel free to call me, Jeremy Raw, 202-366-0986, or send me an email. Or you can get in touch with Dan Goodman, daniel.goodman@dot.gov, and one or other of us can help you sort out your issues. So thanks to everyone for participating, and I think we will call the webinar complete.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jeremy.
And